Good evening, everyone. My name is Fabio. I've been working as an over-the-phone interpreter for the past 3 years. Now I'm also a sworn translator here for Brazil, but more exclusively today I came here to talk about my experience as an OPI. There's a lot of things about how undocumented immigrants work and live in the United States. And if you ever get the chance to work as an over the phone interpreter, you will find yourself in a situation that you have to work with these people. And there are some things that I wish I had known when I first started. And there are some things that I believe I can help you guys a little bit if you ever get the chance to work with people in the situation. Again, referring to undocumented immigrants. A little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not an immigrant expert. I'm not an attorney. So I'm not here to talk about the political situation that is going on in the United States or the present situations for immigrants in the United States. I'm only here to talk about the legal process that they have to go through once they go into the United States and what are some of the scenarios that you might actually find yourselves in if you are trying to work with immigrants in this kind of situations. So let's go moving forwards. So what does it mean to be an undocumented immigrant? You're gonna hear this word a lot. An undocumented immigrant just means an immigrant who does not have the proper documentation to live in the United States. It can either be someone with an expired visa, they have a temporary work visa or student's visa, but then their time expired, they never renew it. Now they are an undocumented immigrant. Or it can be someone who, as it says here on the slide, went through an entry without inspection. That means crossing the border without passing through one of the official port of entries. This is the most common case that you will see. Just a small note here, you might also hear a lot the term illegal immigrant, and you might wonder what's the difference between an illegal immigrant and an undocumented immigrant. And the reality is that there is no difference. But rather than calling people illegal, which is not something very nice, we rather call them just undocumented, which means someone who does not have the proper documentation. But then again, you might ask, so how does someone actually cross the border to the United States? I have some pictures here, which I think is help to portray this image. A lot of people believe that the wall that separates the United States to Mexico is this massive thing that it's impossible to cross, and that's not really what happens. Actually, that's something I'm gonna say a lot of times here. Things are not as complicated as they actually seem to be. So usually you have someone or a group of people who can be smugglers or coyotes, just like the animal, but this time we're talking about people, who are individuals who help someone cross the border illegally into the United States. They either cross the border through the river. The border between Mexico and the United States, it's actually split into two parts. One of them is Rio Grande. It is a river which separates Mexico and the United States. So some people do try to cross the river, but another way is simply the wall. And I say the wall here in quotation marks because as you can see in the image, a lot of people talk about it, but it's not a concrete wall that separates the two places. It's just these iron rods, stakes that they put all across the border, and it's surprisingly easy to cross them. There are some places which are very well known to the BP or the Border Patrol that immigrants can cross the border. They simply cut off one of these steel rods and they can easily cross between one country and the other. But Border Patrol actually prefers to know that these locations exist because it's easier if all the immigrants are congregating in just one place rather than trying to find them all over the border, which again crosses kilometers and kilometers. So, what happens when an immigrant first crosses the border? Another thing that is a misconception that a lot of people think is that, oh, so we're talking about undocumented immigrants. You're talking about illegal immigrants. They had to hire a coyote or a smuggler to be able to cross the border, which by itself is a crime, which means that these people are actually trying to hide and live this criminal life and never get in touch with any kind of authorities or police force. And that's just not true. That's not really what happens. Most immigrants, as soon as they cross the border, the very first things they do is to voluntarily surrender to one of the police authorities in the region, which can either be one of the border patrols that I just talked about, or it can be ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And to put it simply, anytime that I talk about ICE, another word that is used to describe them is just the immigration police. They're the police authority related to anything immigration, well, anything immigration related. So, what does it mean to voluntarily surrender? As soon as an immigrant crosses the border, they will surrender themselves to some kind of authority saying, hey, I just crossed the border illegally, but I wish to stay here in the United States. I wish to go through my due process. And once again, what does it mean to go through a due process? Technically speaking, because this is something that should happen, but we all know in reality things are never as nice as they should be. Everyone deserves due process, which means to go through the correct legal procedures before any sentence is given to you, right? It's that idea of innocent until proven guilty. So it doesn't matter if you are an undocumented immigrant, if you committed a crime to enter the United States, these immigrants cannot be immediately deported to their countries. It doesn't work like that. It shouldn't work like that. Sometimes it does. So these people, even though they cross the border, they have to get a court date. They have to be sent before a judge to have a judge determine their sentence if these people will be deported or not. So if you cross the border and you surrender yourself, there's actually a very long process in which you remain in the United States before anything can happen to you. Especially because there's one very important thing is that there's a lot of asylum seekers in this position. What is or who is an asylum seeker? Is anyone who is requesting protection, shelter, asylum from the United States, in this case specifically, due to fear of persecution from their original country, right? A lot of people, again, they run away to the United States because they no longer felt safe in their country because of situation of war, of climate hazard, or any kind of problem really that could cause them to leave their country of origin and might seek shelter in a different one. And these people, I mean, if you actually are granted asylum in the United States, you are by all means a legal citizen. You're no longer an undocumented immigrant. You do have your proper documentation of being an asylee, which means you have fully completed asylum in the United States. But going back to what usually happens to most undocumented immigrants. So as soon as you cross the border, you surrender yourself to ICE, to the immigration police, to border patrol, and what happens next? You will start your legal proceedings that will determine if you stay or not in the United States, right? Oh, just one more thing that I forgot to mention. I was talking about the asylum seekers. So, if being an asylee is completely legal, why do they still have to go through all these problems? Why do they still have to go through all this trouble if they're supposed to be legal citizens? And it's the idea that crossing the border outside designated locations is a crime no matter what. So even if you have proper documentation because you are an asylum seeker, or maybe even an American citizen that decided to cross the border in a different place, that is still considered a crime. So you still have to deal with customs, with immigration control, and all of that. So you surrender yourself to the authorities. What's next? You are going to be sent to one of the detention centers so that you can start your legal processing. The CBP centers, or the Customs and Borders Protections, They are all these different processing centers where they collect all the data and information about all these immigrants. Again, something that a lot of people are not really aware. You can actually hear a lot of fake news about this, saying that, oh, immigrants, when they get to the United States, they throw away all their documentation because they don't want any authority to know who they are. They don't want to have their identification public. And again, that's simply not true. Actually, the more documentation that you can have your ID from your country of origin, you can have your passport, birth certificate, literally anything here. The more documentation that you have about yourself, the better will be later on for you. We're going to talk more about that later. Because again, what's going on here? So people are in these processing centers, they're having all their data collected. The United States is processing all this information for every single immigrant that is entering the country. And then they have some interviews with all these different people. They usually have two main goals with these interviews. The first one is to check for credible fear. What does it mean to check for credible fear or the credible fear interview? It's a screening to check, oh, why is this person running away from the country of origin and coming to ours? This is usually your first chance to ask for an asylum application, to have an asylum request. That's when most people say, oh, I ran away from my country because I no longer felt safe there. I was being persecuted, so I had to run away for so and so reasons. That's one of the very first things that happen. And the second goal of these interviews is to check for imminent danger. What does it mean to check for imminent danger? They're assessing if you were in some kind of imminent danger back in your country. As in, oh, if, for example, you were to be deported tomorrow, would someone actively try to kill you? Were you actively being persecuted by someone, or did you just felt uncomfortable in the situation that you lived in and you decided to move here? Because again, depending on the imminence of the danger, as in how likely it is to happen, they might move you up or down in a list of priority. And the last thing that should happen in these processing centers is to determine your court date. This is very, very important. Technically, every single undocumented immigrant in the United States should have a court date schedule. This is the most important thing to them, and they receive an NTA, which is a notice to appear, which is pretty much a court summons for them to show up to this one specific court or this court hearing, which will decide if they are deported or not. So you could start to come up with this image that all these undocumented immigrants, they get into the United States, they start this legal procedure where they get all their data collected, all their information collected. They go through this process of interviews, but then they have to wait until their court date. And how long do they have to wait? And this is where the problems start. Because right now, the United States are so booked up, there are actually so many immigrants entering the country that to schedule a court date or a court hearing for immigration procedure might actually take 3 to 4 years. So there are a lot of people, a lot of undocumented immigrants, which are, again, technically allowed to stay in the United States because they are waiting for their court date because they have to. They can't leave the country until their court date happens, so they just have to wait there until it happens. But it might take 3, 4, even 5 years. Something that happens a lot, and if you ever have the chance to see this happening, is that the authorities will always tell them, oh, we're going to schedule your court date for this date next year. But that's always a lie. It's impossible to schedule a court date in just 1 year. What you have to do as an undocumented immigrant, you have to keep checking the date because it will be rescheduled again and again and again until it eventually finds a date, again, maybe 4 to 5 even years later. So this is when the problem starts, as I said, because this person will have to live with no proper documentation in the United States for up to 5 years. How? How do they live without documentation, without actually being able to work, without being considering a proper citizen? So, still at the detention center, the original idea, if you could even say that, is that these people would actually just be uh, stuck. Well, they would be detained at these detention centers until their court date. That was the original plan when this whole procedure was invented. But as I said, there are actually so many people coming in, they don't have enough facilities to store all these people. So they started to send these non-documented immigrants to different places, to different states. And if you ever heard the news about this kind of things, this is usually where we see news talking about families being separated, and it's usually a huge problem because, again, they might not even have all the information about all the family members. And this kind of things do happen. It is a very difficult and dark topics in some situations. But trying to focus on the more useful things, how do these immigrants get, how does it decide which immigrant is going where? Because they actually might move you to a different state. Not, it's actually very likely that it will be moved to a different state, since most of these people are crossing the Texas border, and Texas, once again, pretty much doesn't have any room left for undocumented immigrants. So you will be moved to a different state in the United States. Sometimes, or at least the idea was that during one of the interviews that you go through in the processing center, they will check if you have a sponsor. And what is a sponsor? Is a person, sometimes a family, it can be even a religious group or a community group who agrees to support the immigrant after being released from the processing center. So, if the immigration police or if the customs processing centers know that you have a sponsor, like for example, you just say, oh, I have family in the state of California. Oh, I know that there is a community group in Maine that usually helps undocumented immigrants, and I'm willing to work with them. They will usually try to get you closer to this group of people, to these sponsors. And I do put a lot of emphasis on try because sometimes they just do whatever they want. But there is some organization to all this madness. There is the ISAP. And what is the ISAP? The ISAP. It's the Intensive Supervision Appearance Program, which is pretty much ICE monitoring system. Every single immigrant that goes through this legal procedure will be given a cell phone. This cell phone is supposed to be used exclusively to get in touch with the police, the immigration police, ICE, or anything related to that. So again, even though some people might say, oh, all these undocumented immigrants, they're just trying to hide in the United States, they're committing illegal activities, and the United States have no way to have any kind of control over them. Once again, that's not really true. Almost every single undocumented immigrant in the United States is being checked on. They are either participating in ISAP, and again, the monitoring systems with the immigration police, or they have technically finished it. So ICE is always on check, is always checking where these people are, what they are doing, if everything is okay. Again, it's not, how can I say this? It's not a very well meant surveillance systems, right? Let's be honest here, they're not trying to really protect these immigrants, they're really trying to protect the United States itself. The idea is that if these people, the immigrants, ever do so much as to look at the police officer wrong or just get someone on a bad day, that by itself might be enough to get them in trouble or to get all their immigration procedure just straight up canceled and get on the deportation list. But what what matters is, again, the police is always on your trail. They know what's going on. It's not as people say that the United States has no idea what's going on. That's just not true. But then again, Everyone asks the question, so how does these undocumented immigrants survive? If they have to stay up to 5 years in the United States with no proper documentation, not really being allowed to work because you need a work permit to be able to work legally. You if you can't work, you can't have any money, so you can't really buy food, you can't buy shelter, you can't buy a place to live. What do you do? The first thing that is always suggested to all the people in the situation, and again, if you ever get a chance to work as an OPI, you probably find yourself in this very specific scenario, which is requesting for asylum. An undocumented immigrant is different from someone who is an asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is simply any person who has started with their asylum application. It doesn't even matter if it's granted, if it's been denied. If you simply started the process, it means you're actively seeking for asylum, which means you have proper documentation to live in the United States. So you are no longer an undocumented immigrant. You're not a permanent citizen, but you do have a legal documentation that allows you to stay there, even though it might be temporary. But to file an asylum request is not as easy as it seems. First of all, there is a deadline. So immigrants must file their asylum application up to 1 year after they arrived in the United States. So you might hear a lot of cases of people saying, I didn't know I had to do this, I didn't know I could do this, or simply I didn't know how to do this. And if it's 1 year after they have arrived in the United States, they're no longer valid to ask for an asylum application. And again, the United States know when you enter the country because you went through all those procedures back at the Customs and Border Protection Centers. But as I have said many times before, when you do start your asylum application, how long does it take to decide if it will be granted or not? It can take months, it can take even more years. But this time, this is actually a good thing. There's a lot of people who live in the United States which are in this gray area, which are people who requested their asylum application, but still haven't had their results or haven't had their court date happened. Because once again, it might take so long because all the courts are so booked up that you just live in this gray space, you're just constantly waiting, and you haven't had a judge decide if your case will be granted or not. So it might actually be a good thing if your asylum application takes that long, because it means it gives you more time to live in the United States or to find a secondary way of living in case you don't get granted asylum. And what determines if you get granted asylum or not? You have to present yourself before a judge and they will analyze your case. You have to tell your whole story about what happened, why did you decide to run away from your country, why you should be allowed to live in the United States. And they usually try to settle on 4 different topics to determine if it's valid or not. You have to demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, and or political opinion and social group. Usually these last two are seen as just one thing. If you can prove that you have fear of persecution in one of these topics, usually, and again I say usually very strongly here, you should be granted asylum. But things never go as you wish they would. Additionally, another good thing about asking for asylum, as I just said, you lose the title of undocumented immigrant and you become an asylum seeker, is that simply being an asylum seeker gives you the chance of getting a work permit or the EAD, which is an employment authorization document, which just means that you are allowed to work legally in the United States. So it's one step in the right direction. And I just had some information here, which I find it interesting. I was just talking about how difficult it is to get your asylum case granted. All this information is from 2023, and you can see from all the undocumented immigrants from Brazil, only 10% of the cases were actually granted. Oh, does it mean that 90% was denied? Not necessarily. because as you can see, most of the information for Brazil, which is 56%, means other. And what does it mean by other? Most likely, it just means that the person never showed up to the court hearing. They already know that the case is probably going to be denied, so they just decide to not go forward with the process. And from that moment forward, yes, they will be actively hiding in the United States. They will be an undocumented immigrant, probably on the deportation list. And just some other useful information here. For example, we have Angola, even though they don't receive a lot of undocumented immigrants from Angola. Since they also speak Portuguese in Angola, you might find yourself working with people from Angola. But you can see that the grant rate for asylum is much higher. It's up to 47%. And then you also have other countries like Guatemala and Mexico, which are actually even lower, like 8 and 4% of grant cases. So, assuming you survived all of that, you went through the processing centers, they sent you to probably a random state in the United States. You don't even know where you are. You might not even know anyone there. How do you survive? There are some social services, some government services that are willing to help people in this situation. Mainly, there are the DSHS or the DHHS. To put it simply, the Department of Social and Health Services or Department of State Health Services. And what's the difference between these two? There's none. They are literally the same thing, the same agency, but depending on the state in which you are in, they have a different name. It's just different states in the United States doing different things. But they have the same idea, which is a public agency, a governmental agency trying to help people who can't afford basic services. So, when you work with people in the situation, you might hear a lot of acronyms. And this is usually the things that helps a lot to have heard these things before or to have someone teach you them. For example, hear a lot about TANF. TANF means TANF, which is again a public service to help families with children to get money and food. You have other programs like SNAP and WIC, which are food assistance programs for eligible individuals. Very important here when I say eligible individuals, because again, technically speaking, an undocumented immigrant does not have any, and I mean not a single right in the United States because you're not a citizen. Therefore, you do not get any Americans' rights. But if you have some kind of documentation, as I talked at the very beginning, that shows, oh no, I am an undocumented immigrant, but I did go through all the immigration process. Here's my documentation when I went through the customs processing center. Here is my asylum application. Here's all the information that they collected on me. Just having this kind of information is already really helpful and might determine if you're eligible or not for some of these benefits. So once again, most undocumented immigrants in the United States are not people trying to hide themselves from the police. Rather, are people with very well registered documents, even though the name says not documented. They're just not documents valid in the United States. And of course, additionally, there are even other things like, for example, food banks, which are usually places which are community driven or driven by, again, religious institution, which are public service to help people in need who can afford for food. And as well, places for shelter. I have some examples here, but once again, usually places run by the community to help people in this kind of situations. Just a personal note here that comes from my experience. I worked a lot with the DHHS in the state of Maine. And one example, they had this department which was called GA, General Assistance, and one was the most important departments in the DHHS center. Again, depending on the state in which you are in, you're gonna hear different acronyms, different names, but they're usually the same thing. In this case, particularly, GA, even though the name is General Assistance, it was actually very specific. It was trying to help undocumented immigrants find shelter. They would either find community-driven places that could allocate them, or they themselves would rent out hotels, hotel rooms, and offer them to the undocumented immigrants. But assuming you even get the chance to get one of these benefits, it's usually still not enough to survive. Because again, we're talking about people who have to survive for at least a few years in the United States until they actually get their court date. And of course, the main idea is to live there permanently. What do they have to do? If they actually were able to go through their asylum application, they will maybe get a work permit. But even that takes up to 150 days, maybe even more. So half a year at least, maybe an entire year until you get your work permit. And the reality to a lot of these people is that they just work without the proper documentation. They're usually paid under the table, as we say, which just means that these people are being paid in cash. They never get to sign a contract. They don't get a paycheck at the end of the week or the end of the month. They just get paid either daily or based on the amount of hours that they worked. So again, they're working as day laborers. Is a way that we call them sometimes. And you would be surprised how many people work in this kind of situation. And you'd be even more surprised how many people are willing to hire people in this situation. Again, you're probably going to hear a lot on the news about ICE, right? Immigration's police raids on different restaurants, on different hotels, on different landscaping agencies, construction agencies, trying to go for all these workers which are non-documented immigrants, but they never go after the employers, the people who hire them. Because hiring someone without the proper documentation by itself, it's also a crime. But again, that's a talk for a different day. But yes, the reality is you do have a lot of people working without proper documentation, but that's what they have to do to get by. And as I've said before, of course, these people will be going through a lot of different challenges, a lot of different trials and tribulations that they have to survive to be able to live their life in the United States. As I said before, there are the ICE check-ins, which are usually monthly meetings that they have to attend. That's when their police officers or the policial authority will check what's going on. Are they actually trying to find a job? As in, are they legally trying to find a job? Are they getting any kind of social services? What's going on with their life, where they are residing, and all things like that. It can be either an in-person meeting or a phone meeting. I have had the experience, I would say the unfortunate experience to interpret some of these meetings. And I would say they are really a not nice thing to do, right? These things are very, very serious. The officers here do not take anything lightly. Again, if you are an immigrant in the situation, you're really trying to get the police officer in their best case, in their best day, because if you do anything to leave them in a bad mood, it can completely ruin your case. So, again, even though they are legally, or sorry, technically, I should say, living in the United States, because even though they don't have the proper documentation, they have to remain in the United States until their court date. It's still very important sometimes to simply avoid any contact with the authority, because if anything bad happens, your entire case might be dismissed. So again, it's not that these people are trying to hide from the police because they're illegal, they are undocumented. It's just more so that if you get in trouble with anyone, really, it's tenfold for you, right? It's 10 times the trouble for you than it is to anyone else. But if you ever get the chance to work as an OPI, how might you find yourself in a situation with immigrants like this? Again, I think it's very important to understand all this legal procedure and what happens, because you might be called for service in any of these steps. You might be called for an interview, for a credible fear interview, while they are all the way back in the processing center, right after they cross the border. You might be called for a meeting with an attorney right after they get allocated to a different state and they are trying to file their asylum application. You might get in a call with someone with one of the governmental agencies trying to offer their benefits. So you're gonna have to understand all the different acronyms, all the different programs so that you might help them. You might be called for medical appointments, not even necessarily an undocumented immigrant, just someone who doesn't speak English in the United States. Go to a medical appointment, they need someone to be able to talk to the doctor for them. So you'll be called in this kind of situation. So this is a service that is very high on demand in the United States, especially right now. It's especially since COVID. So there's a lot of opportunities to work here. And again, as I was saying, right, these people will be living in this kind of situations, but there are some community resources always available to them. Even though the United States is known for not having a lot of public services, public education is free in the United States, no matter what, if you have proper documentation or not. So again, I was talking about different services that you might be called in. One of them that you might get a lot is simply being called into a school because there might be a parent-teachers meeting or a parent trying to enroll their kid into school. That also happens a lot. Another place here that I mentioned is ILAP. This is a law firm that is located in Maine. I used to work with them, and they used to take voluntary interpreters way back during COVID. I don't know if they still do, but I have the link here if anyone is interested. But I worked them for a while, and what they would do is, again, they would have this. Of course, they are a non-profit organization, right? They are pro bono, so they wouldn't charge the immigrants, but they would have these interviews where they would try to help people file for their asylum application. And that's when you'd see that it's an actually very complex and very complicated scenario. Another thing that is another acronym that you guys might hear is the DACA. This is a legal proceeding, I guess you could call that, which pretty much means that children are not to be held responsible for the parents' action. This means that, for example, if you are a family of non-documented immigrants that goes to the United States, sometimes the child might receive some kind of priority rather than the parents, because there's this argument that, oh, the child cannot be held responsible for the parents' actions because the parents brought the child here without their consent, because, of course, they are the parents and the child isn't old enough. So again, you might hear some news on this kind of scenarios that the child might be granted asylum, but sometimes the parents are not. But once again, this is a very complex situation. So just some final thoughts here. I know this might be a little bit of a dark topic, but I always like to talk about this because, again, it's a very on-demand topic. It's also, if you are ever to work as a consecutive interpreter, you might find yourself in this position. And I do believe it's very important to know all this immigration process, all the social service terminology, to understand the legal pathways that all these people might go through, to simply know in what kind of situation they are and to better help them. And of course, if you are going to work in this kind of scenario, just my personal recommendation, be prepared for very emotional and heavy conversations, because you might hear people talking about why they had to run away from the country and what happened to their family and how difficult it was, this process of crossing the border. And it's never easy, but it can also be a very fulfilling job when you actually get to help people in the situation. But overall, that's it. Thank you for listening to me. I hope that at least some of the terms and all this context that I just explained help you guys in the future situations. And if you have any questions, I'm here open to anything. Thank you.